Okay, this is the Wednesday night meeting for April for SouthWest Writers. And our speaker tonight is Ellen Meeropol. She is the author of several novels, Her Sister's Tattoo, Kinship of Clover, On Hurricane Island, House Arrest, and the forthcoming Lost Women of the Azalea Court. Her work has been honored by the Women's National Book Association, the Sarton Prize, and the Massachusetts Center for the Book. And tonight, she's going to be speaking about evil characters we love to hate. And so I'm turning this over to Ellen.
Okay. Thank you. Can you see my slide, folks? Somebody, Brenda, can you see that? You're muted, so I can't tell.
Yes.
I can see
Yes.
it just fine. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, and good evening, and thank you for inviting me. My plan for the next 45 minutes is to explore how evil characters or villains operate in our fiction and how we can best use them to deepen our stories. We'll look at the elements of a villain and how other writers have used evil to increase conflict and also expand the meaning of their work. I'll suggest some writing exercises that can help develop our evil characters. These are quick exercises, 3 minutes each, to jumpstart how we see, how we develop our bad guy characters. And then we'll have some time for your questions and comments. And there we go. It's always kind of interesting to start looking at some definitions. The dictionary tells us that evil is morally reprehensible, that it causes harm, that it can be sinful or wicked, that it brings sorrow or calamity. An evil character functions in certain ways within our stories. The motives, the evil motives may be important to the plot. The character often opposes the hero or the protagonist, might be a scoundrel or criminal, might not, might be blamed for a particular evil or difficulty within your story. It's important to remember, though, that a villain is a particular type of antagonist, the character in opposition to the main character or protagonist, but not all antagonists are villains. We're going to talk tonight about that subset, who are bad guys. Let's take a moment to think about this question. Think about who your favorite literary villains are. And perhaps you can keep this in mind as we deconstruct the evil character. It might help you understand what kind of villain appeals to you and suggest some directions for your own work. And it's really important to keep this in mind as well, that nobody is a villain in their own story. We're all the heroes of our own stories, and that goes for our characters as well. So why do we need evil characters in our stories, in our novels? Well, because evil characters help make our fiction come alive. Fiction is about trouble, and villains create conflict and tension. They're often the catalyst for the plot. They make it hard for the protagonist to get what they want, complicating the story. Villains also can help us explore and think about the nature of evil in our world. So maybe we need evil characters, but why do we love them, if we do love them? I think we love them for all of the plot and dramatic reasons we mentioned a minute ago, all the things that they do in their stories. Some of the most memorable characters in literature are not the folks you want for a friend. They're not the people you want to have dinner with. They're selfish and naughty and deceitful and sly and just plain nasty. Sometimes they make us feel smug and superior. They also often unnerve us and scare us and maybe excite us. But the bottom line is that bad guys make good fiction. Villains are a critical part of the storytelling traditions, but the classical villain of fairy tales or comic books, the guy dressed in black, cackling and rubbing his hands together as he contemplates his evil deeds, may not be all that useful for us today. The modern literary villain is complicated, usually a character with a history, with yearnings, with unfulfilled wants, motivating his or her behavior. Really, the same kinds of things that motivate our heroes. The villain is often driven by the conviction that her cause is just, whether it be revenge or jealousy or whatever. A good villain is smart and powerful, a worthy opponent. We're going to talk about 3 different kinds of villains and look at some examples. We're going to talk about the stranger villain, and we'll take a little bit of a look at the novel Little Bee by Chris Cleave. We're going to talk about a villain who is very close to the protagonist. And our example for that will be Rufus in Kindred by Octavia Butler. And we'll talk about the kind of evil character who's really a representative of external evil, like Big Brother in 1984, or President Snow, the dictator in the Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. So in this example of a stranger villain, the villain isn't even a main character, but he has enormous power in this book. I'm going to read this paragraph from Little Bee. There was a leader. He had a wound in his neck. It was rotting. I could smell it. I knew he was going to die soon. Another of the men wore a wire necklace, and it was strung with dried brown things that looked like mushrooms. When he saw Kindness, this man pointed at her. Then he made circles on his nipples with his fingers, and he grinned. The torturing and murdering soldiers who work for the Nigerian oil companies don't get a lot of page time in this novel, but they have an enormous emotional impact on the reader. In this quote, the bad guys have followed 2 village girls, Kindness and Little Bee, to a beach. Chris Cleave, the author, did a really smart thing here. He gave the lead soldier a pus-filled wound on his neck. Although he is definitely a villain, he's also human, and he's dying. We're given a glimpse of the suffering human being in the same paragraph that we're reminded of the awful things these soldiers have done and are threatening to do to 2 young girls. I think that Kindred is an almost perfect novel, and it's a good example of a villain who is very close to the protagonist. So close, in fact, that the bad guy almost merges at times with the protagonist's husband. If you haven't read this book, the main character, Dana, is a young African-American woman who is mysteriously snatched away from her Los Angeles home and husband in 1976 and transported to a slave plantation in 1815 Maryland to rescue a drowning white boy, Rufus. 6 times, Rufus is in mortal danger and somehow summons Dana across the country and the centuries to keep him alive long enough to father a child by his slave, who is Dana's great-great-grandmother. Rufus is a slave owner and not an enlightened man. He's also her relative, and he shares some characteristics with Dana's husband, who is also white. Butler merges these 2 white men in a pretty interesting way. If you can just take a quick look at this, I'm not going to read it out loud, but he basically has them echo each other's words, a few paragraphs or sometimes a page apart, making us realize subtly that these 2 characters have a lot in common. 1984 by George Orwell is, of course, a classic example of the villain being much bigger than one person. There will be no loyalty except loyalty towards the party. There will be no love except the love of Big Brother. There will be no laughter except the laugh of triumph over a defeated enemy. There will be no art, no literature, no science. That quote always sort of makes my blood run cold. Any questions about the types of villains? Have I left any out that you can think of? You have a question or a comment, use your electronic hand so that Brenda or somebody can notice, because I probably won't be able to see you on my laptop screen. Any questions, or should we move ahead? Okay. So how do we avoid writing cardboard villains? Well, pretty much the same way we avoid any cardboard characters, right? We need to walk in our villain's shoes and see through their eyes to understand them. I've got to admit that this can be pretty difficult. My second novel is a thriller, and the bad guy terrified me so much that I had to change my writing schedule to accommodate walking in his shoes. I used to write at night before going to sleep, and I had to switch to writing in the early morning before work because writing this guy gave me nightmares. We need to know, however, what makes our villains tick, what they want, what they need, and how their humanity is twisted in service to our story. So let's talk about craft, about how we develop specifically our bad guy characters. Developing a villain, whether it be a stranger or a sister or society, we need to consider 5 main issues. First is backstory. What happened to this character to bring her to this place? Motivation. What drives this character? What do they want? What do they need, or what do they think they need? Complexity. Show us something of this character's inner life, complex inner life, even if their actions are ugly. The fourth is conviction. How does this character justify their evil actions? And finally, humanity. How do we understand that this character is a full person? What human characteristics do they have? Empathy, maybe, or something else? So our plan next is to review each of these areas, look at an example from a published book, and try a short writing exercise to practice each element. We'll start with backstory. The reader needs to know why your villain is the way he or she is. What happened in childhood or adulthood, 50 years ago or 10 minutes ago, to put the character on a collision course with the protagonist or the good guy of your story. The better the backstory, the more relatable your bad guy is, the more complicated and nuanced the evil, the deeper your story can be, and the more your reader will be compelled by it. The character's backstory is how the reader learns that history. I'm going to read a paragraph from Flannery O'Connor's classic short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. I never was a bad boy that I remember of, the misfit said in an almost dreamy voice, but somewheres along the line, I'd done something wrong and got sent to the penitentiary. I was buried alive. It was a head doctor at the penitentiary said, what I had done was kill my daddy, but I'd known that for a lie. I think this is a really interesting example of a villain who operates on a lot of levels. We feel that he has a very complex life behind him. It's a short story, not a novel, so we don't know the details, but they're hinted at. And then we have his name. He's a serial killer, has just escaped from prison. And we know that bad things are going to happen in this story. But his name suggests something different. His name suggests a different kind of man, a man who never fit in. In addition, the victims in this story are not very likable. The grandmother is prideful, bossy, racist, self-righteous. She is majorly annoying. It is tragic when she and her family are shot, but we still have a bit of empathy, perhaps, for the killer as a man who never fit in, and a bit of whose backstory we've come to understand through his way, making his way through this story. Okay, so we're going to do a few flash exercises. These are sort of focused free writing. They are very short, 3 minutes. Clearly, you won't write a finished scene, but hopefully you will get an insight, a flash of understanding into your evil character. So the first exercise is to write a flashback from your villain's past, something that gives insight into her current self. You can do this however it works for you, but when I start to imagine and write the backstory for a character, I like to write it in first person, and I often start with a prompt like, I've never told anyone about what happened when I was 10 years old. Okay, next we're going to talk about motivation. What drives your villain? What is it that your villain wants so badly that they'll do evil things to get what they want? Motivation is, of course, critical for all of our characters, but I think it's doubly so for our villain. What do they want, and do we believe their reasons? This short quote is from the Do Breakers. He endorsed the public story, the one that the preacher had killed himself, and she accepted that he had only arrested him and turned him over to someone else. neither believing the other nor themselves, but never delving further back in time, history, or memory beyond the night they'd met. The he in this quote is a refugee from Haiti, a man who presented himself as a victim, but turns out to have been a member of the Tantam Makut, the Dew Breakers, the death squad. She is his wife. So what's his motivation at this time in the story? I think it's avoidance of the awful things he has done, especially not wanting their daughter to find out who he really was. A perfectly reasonable motivation, and one I think we can all understand, and a motivation that makes the reader feel some empathy as well as some horror at this man. So take up your pencil again, because the second short writing exercise is about motivation. Put your protagonist and your villain together in a short scene. Use only dialogue and internal thoughts. No exposition, no explanation. Your villain wants something and the protagonist won't give it. Could be as major as acknowledgement of a crime or as small as a seat on the train. Let us see your villain's motivation. The third element is particularly interesting to me, and that is, are we so sure that the villain is really the bad guy? I guess I could have called this ambiguity instead of complexity. There are at least two ways of thinking about this. Most commonly, it's used in thrillers or mystery novels where it might not be clear for much of the story who is the good guy. Gone Girl is a great example of this. But some novels, like Dennis Lehane's Gone Baby Gone, which was made into a film by Ben Affleck, actually pose a more interesting moral dilemma. Is the evil act really the morally right one? In other words, is it wrong? Is it illegal, but morally just? I think complexity is also really critical in any kind of politically engaged fiction. And we often think about it in terms of, does the end justify the means that the villain uses? Interesting things to think about and write about. And really an interesting corollary from Jeff Johns, who is a comic book author and screenwriter. He says, the characters who have grays are the more interesting characters. The hero who sometimes crosses the line and the villain who sometimes doesn't are just much more interesting. Food for thought. Let's return to the Dew Breakers for a minute about the death squads in Haiti. Eventually, the young woman learns that her beloved father was a torturer back in Haiti. In an interview about the book, which is a collection of linked short stories, Dandekut said this: even if someone is a torturer, you don't have the luxury of writing him off, of not listening to him when you're writing about him. You have to live your characters' lives with them. They have to be sympathetic in some way. Understanding the complexity of a difficult character's life is most appealing to me as a writer. So, writing exercise number 3 on complexity. Is there a way that a reader might question the evil nature of the character? Is there something about his or her actions that could be interpreted as less evil than on the surface? Give us a very quick monologue from your evil character about why his or her actions are really not so bad. Perhaps why the protagonist deserves what he gets. Something that expresses the complicated feelings and situations of your story.
Ellen, Nancy Smart has a question. She asks, so is Dexter a complex villain or a villain at all? What do you think?
I'm not sure who Dexter is.
Nancy, did you want to elaborate a little bit on your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dexter is he's actually a crime scene investigator,
Uh-huh.
kills villains. So he knows all about evidence and stuff. So he puts out big pieces of plastic, and he always uses knives. I mean, it's a pretty bloody thing.
Uh-huh.
Background was there's something wrong with him, and his father found out about it and told him to convinced him to only kill bad guys.
Okay, so that's a really wonderful example of complexity. And, you know, I think that there are times that we write books in which they can be interpreted one of two ways, or possibly more ways. So it's up to the reader sometimes to decide, is this person a villain or not? Certainly they are doing illegal acts, but do those ends justify the means of killing? What do you think? Is he a villain?
Well, they had a whole series on TV. There are books.
Uh-huh.
And books didn't show him as, I mean, you didn't get more sympathy, maybe because, there was a live actor playing him. I don't know. I always had mixed feelings about it. He's doing, he's killing really bad, awful guys like serial killers, stuff like that. But of course, he is breaking the law, and
we do have a justice system that's supposed to be taking care of this, right? So I think it's a great example of a situation which it sounds like the author wants that ambiguity and wants the reader to have to be making those kinds of determinations.
But he is pretty antisocial too. I mean, he doesn't have natural relationships with people.
Right, right.
He even gets married, but he doesn't really feel anything.
All right, thank you. We're gonna move on to the idea of conviction. What is your villain's view of the story? How does this character justify their actions to themselves? And, who knows what Dexter might say about the reason for the killing. Maybe he thinks he's doing the right thing. Maybe he just likes to kill. Sometimes learning your villain's side of the story demands really giving him center stage, maybe even letting him be the narrator. And that's what happened to me the first time I wrote a villain. It was entirely by accident. I was working on a short story told from the point of view of a young woman on a Caribbean island, the daughter of the dictator of that island, who joined the rebels against her father and was killed by her father's troops. The story was just not working. There was plenty of drama, but it felt stiff and didactic until I realized that the most interesting characters were the soldiers who killed her, the villains. They had watched her grow up, and now their orders were to assassinate her. Once I delved into the internal struggle of those soldiers and gave them a voice to narrate the story, it really came alive. I'm going to read from the end of that short story to give you an idea of that. We never dreamed it would go this far. We underestimated her zeal and her father's too. When our orders came, we verified them with our commander, then shook our heads. Our assignment was simple, but we carefully planned every detail. That last evening, we assembled in our places at the edge of campus, facing the building where the rebels hid. We never considered how history would judge us. Still, at the last moment, those of us not carrying rifles closed our eyes. Okay, so exercise number 4 is to write a monologue in which your bad guy finally gets to tell her side of the story. You might start it with this prompt. Let me tell you what's really going on here. Finally, does the humanity of your bad guy show, even in small glimpses? Because often the villain's internal self-image is at odds with his or her external deeds. For me, the challenge is to create evil characters who do bad things, who frighten us, but who also reflect something of our own imperfect humanity. I'm going to end this with a quote from the opening paragraph of Roxane Gay's 2014 novel, An Untamed State. Once upon a time in a far-off land, I was kidnapped by a gang of fearless yet terrified young men with so much impossible hope beating inside their bodies, it burned their very skin and strengthened their will right through their bones. And I think because of the time, I'm going to stop here. There was one more writing exercise, which was basically to show a small and subtle way the humanity of a villain. But I think at this point, I would rather open this up to questions and hear what you have to say. And